can we expand paratransit services? Can we provide these at lower cost to society and in quicker response times than are currently offered? Can we enter into suburban areas that are less well served by public transportation, for instance? Can we move even into rural areas? Can we provide first mile, last mile connectivity opportunities? And with the future possibly holding connected automated vehicles in our future, how could these things couple together and what implications could there be? So we were really interested in the opportunities of leveraging the strengths of these new services, but being very mindful of opportunities to fill gaps at the same time. We also felt that there were great opportunities for partnerships between the public and private sector that I think are currently being explored and are likely to continue. Now this leads us to the data and research component. So we really felt that there was an absence of data and that more of that was desperately needed to help with the policy framing discussion, as well as just evaluation and the evolution of these services. We concluded that new methodologies were definitely needed to help us to understand how to use this type of data and how we might use that to impact future transportation planning. So as metropolitan regions and local regions look to their future, how could we develop models and tools that would help to integrate these new services that are currently not captured? We also felt that some form of information clearinghouse was very desirable to somehow provide dissemination of the data on travel behavior so that researchers and thought leaders and individuals in the public sector interested in understanding these modes better would have access to them. I wanted to share with you that UC Berkeley, under my direction, is leading a study now on the transportation network company effects. We are funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and the Natural Resources Defense Council is overseeing this study. We are working with both Lyft and Uber on the study. We will be gathering essentially 3 forms of data. One is activity data itself coming from the platforms. The second is a driver survey to get a sense of driver behavior. And the third is rider behavior, so coming directly from the rider. It's almost impossible, or if not impossible, to get an understanding of the full effects without information from the drivers and the riders themselves. The activity data doesn't tell us the whole picture, particularly if we're looking for implications for greenhouse gas emissions. For example, we must know the characteristics of the fleet. So that needs to come from either the drivers and the riders themselves or off the platforms. So I wanted to share that with the committee. And before I conclude, I wanted to just talk about just thoughts for us for the future. Is as we look again to these growing suite of shared mobility services, and again, there's more than just TNCs, e-hail, taxis in this mix, how could that affect auto use overall as well as ownership? And I think the committee, again, spent a lot of time talking about the land use implications, the implications for public transportation, and how this even might affect how people choose to live and work. What types of decisions might they make there? We also have a keen eye to the future, which could include connected automated vehicles and how they might affect these types of services. And ensuring equity and access, I would like to underscore that this is something the committee spent a fair amount of time on and was very conscious of. And in light of all of this evolution and the potential for higher occupancies in particular, which we thought showed great promise, not just for TNCs, but also for taxis in the form of splitting, how could potentially these services lead to a brighter environmental future, but at the same time maximizing social benefits for all? And with that, I'd like to conclude, but I'd love to also acknowledge a second time the committee, because there were many members who were part of this, and definitely acknowledge Brian. He was our chair. He did a fantastic job leading us through this report. So thank you.
Great. So good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's always great to come to California. I've spent a lot of time here. I went to Cal. So I have good familiarity with the industry in California as well as nationally and internationally. I'm going to focus on some of the key issues related to the impact on the taxi industry and where regulation should be taken from here in what is a very fast evolving and complex area combining taxi and TNC areas. So the first point I want to make is really builds off what Susan said, that these are not new industries, and in addition, it's not new that they're growing. In the past 10 years, there's been a 42% increase. This can be seen in a couple of ways. One is in the past 10 years or so, there's been a 42% increase in revenues for taxi and limousine services. This is all pre-TNC. And in addition, another indicator, a 32% increase in the number of people working as taxi and limousine drivers. That's both true overall, and if you look at the full-time worker numbers as well. This is the picture pre-TNC, so you had growth in this field after, in earlier years, not as fast growth. More recently, of course, the picture has changed. So what's happening with cabs is across the country, the number of people using taxi cabs has been on the decline. These are published reports, San Francisco 20 to 30%. There's data through 2014 in LA showing 24% decline. And I've heard higher figures when including the last year. I worked on a study in New York City, and we saw a 19% decline over the last couple of years. And figures across the country show changes of a similar magnitude. Now, it's no surprise why this is happening. It's competition from Uber and Lyft primarily as the new TNCs. And I'm sure you've heard much of this. There's two schools of thought about this. One school of thought is, well, that's the American way. That's competition. The TNCs provide, in the view of many people, much more attractive ride service. It's easier to request using the apps. You have a shorter wait for the vehicle and driver to arrive, a more comfortable in-vehicle experience, and seamless payment at the end of the ride. You get out and it's charged to your credit card. You don't have to figure out the tip and fumble with cash. And of course, the TNCs, many customers, commentators, and elected officials take that view. The other view is that it's unfair competition. And people who take this view cite that there are lower standards for criminal record checks and for auto insurance, a wider choice of vehicles. Often regulation prescribes specific types of vehicles or vehicle ages on the taxi side, but not the TNC side. Surge pricing, so more flexibility in pricing, both to surge price when demand is high and to reduce fares, as the TNCs have been doing. Uncontrolled entry, you don't have to apply to add vehicles or drivers. And there's no requirements that the TNCs cover specific geographic areas or provide wheelchair accessible service. So those are sort of the 2 points of view, and I'm sure they're not new to anyone in this room. So then the question is, what should be done? And again, one view is that it's a different regulatory model needed on the TNC side because the business model is different. And the other view, which I think has evolved in probably some constructive ways, moving from trying to block the TNCs from operating to recognizing, which I think is a big finding of the committee, is that the real task on the taxi industry side is the need to be competitive. And that's something that both the industry needs to be looking at and working on and needs to be worked on from a regulatory standpoint. So what the report calls for, in essence, and what our committee spent a lot of time in developing, is really a very simple set of core recommendations to encourage and facilitate innovation that meet mobility needs, while also, and really the theme of this afternoon session, is to ensure fair competition between taxis and TNCs. Obviously, this is a challenge in finding the balance between those, and I'll use the remainder of my remarks to really address some considerations in looking for that, for how you balance those considerations. And this is a process, this is a new set of issues. No one has the secret sauce here, the magic formula. And so both regulators and elected officials are looking for how to strike the balance and the path toward an effective regulatory regime that also encourages innovation and more effective ride services. So the starting point to this is the current, quote, playing field is unlevel on a number of different scores. Fleet size and price are set by regulation for taxi cabs, whereas TNCs have flexibility in doing so. Cabs are often subject to requirements to provide service in geographic areas. They're also limited by city boundaries and sometimes zones within those city boundaries, whereas TNCs are not. On the other side, TNCs are limited to picking up prearranged calls. You use the app. They cannot pick up at a taxi stand. They cannot pick up an airport hail or get in line. They cannot get in line at an airport stand or pick up a street hail. As I mentioned earlier, driver background checks require often fingerprint check for cab drivers. The TNCs do their own checks using private companies. Vehicle safety standards are often more extensive on the taxi side, as is vehicle insurance requirements, as Brian mentioned. And service quality, how do you ensure good service quality? On the taxi side, I would characterize more as a mix of government set standards and using competition, whereas there's much more emphasis on the TNC side to coming about from a competitive dynamic. So that's where we start. Where should we go? The committee's recommendations for fair competition covered all of these different areas. And I'll just take them one by one. On entry controls and pricing, there we go. The committee recommends examining the minimum regulation needed, taking into account the very important distinction between street hail / taxi stand trips and those trips where you call on the phone and request a cab or you use an app. When you do the latter, you have the ability to choose companies. You can choose the company you want to use based on your own experience, their reputation, what your neighbor's experience is, what you read in the newspaper, driver ratings, a number of different things. And there's a good competitive dynamic that takes place on the dispatch side because that stems from that ability of passengers to choose. If I don't like a company, I can try another company. I use the same car service company when I go to the airport in New York because I like that company. They come in 5 minutes, they're reliable, they're safe, the drivers are courteous. I've tried other companies, they were lower priced, didn't like them quite so much. And so, I've seen that service improve over the years through that competition. On the other side, if you use a taxi stand, if you use a cab at a taxi stand or street hail, you generally take the next one that comes. You don't have too much information about that cab or about that driver. If you don't like the experience one day, you can't use that information or experience to decide which one to take or which one not to take. And so the consumer has much less power of choice, and so that's not operating through the system. And so there's a greater, more extensive need for regulation on the taxi stand and street hail side of the equation than on the dispatch side. So this is an important distinction in thinking about kind of where regulation goes from here. In terms of driver background checks and insurance requirements, and Brian has mentioned this, the committee recommends the importance of being consistent across each type and having a systematic evaluation, particularly on the driver background checks. There's not much information out there in terms of what's effective, in terms of the background check up front and then the ongoing monitoring of drivers in terms of ensuring safety and quality. Wheelchair accessible service. Now, this is a very hard area. There have been many very strong attempts to provide good wheelchair service to people who need them, and with mixed success. We recommend that there continue to be work on this, and that there's a need to ensure access through regulation, some mix of regulation, incentives, mandates, and most likely subsidies. There's very few examples where this service can be economically provided without some types of subsidies, and that those, whatever that mix is and whatever that approach is, that it be applied across the sector so that there's a level playing field and it's not required of one sector and not another. And then in another challenging policy area in terms of regulatory authority, the committee recommends that there be a careful assessment of the balance, the sort of competing needs. On the one hand, there are benefits to uniformity of regulation that you get with a statewide or regional level of regulation. On the other hand, there are real benefits to having it at the local level where it can be tailored to local conditions. I'm sure everyone on the committee is aware, and I'm aware from having worked for the regulatory and transit agencies in a number of cities in California, including San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose, that there are vast variations in the way the industry is structured, in the profile of trips, and in the geography of these cities, which makes a tremendous impact on how the service needs to be provided and what the challenges to doing that are. And then finally, it's important, whatever the approach in terms of regulatory authority is, to ensure that there is good enforcement of that, good street, and in particular on the street enforcement. This is an industry that needs to have enforcement officers, enforcement personnel out in the field actively enforcing the rules, and that's something that's been proven over and over again over the years. So I'd like to give a few comments on the implications of these recommendations for regulation. And we can talk about this more, I hope, in the Q&A. First, to think about this in terms of matching the extent of regulation to the level of competition and user choice. So I spoke about this a few minutes ago. The parts of these industries, and there are both taxi companies and TNCs that are providing trips on a prearranged way, where you need a lower, where you can leave more to the competitive dynamic in terms of service quality, not safety, but in terms of service quality. And whereas you need more extensive regulation on the taxi stand and street hail side of the equation. And then the airport originating trips are sort of a mix of those because they're both a stand, a taxi stand in character using the next vehicle, but you have a lot of control in that environment. And so they tend to take their own kind of set of regulatory approaches. There's a need to control entry and fares, the number of vehicles and fares, primarily in the hail and stand part of the market, and much less in the dispatch part of the market. As we've said now several times, using risk-based analysis to set the requirements for background checks and insurance, to continue to focus on, I guess I'm ahead of myself here, to continue to focus on ways of providing wheelchair accessible trips. One of the things I've seen that tends to be helpful in this respect is to aggregate the wheelchair accessible trips over from ADA, paratransit services that federal law mandates transit agencies provide, taxi services across the board, because there's a relatively small number of these trips. It's hard to have a vehicle nearby given the trip volumes. The more you aggregate them from different sources, the more you're able to serve that well. To ensure consistency and coordination, and I've spoken of this in terms of the jurisdictional issues, California is actually an exception among large states in having this split where the state regulates TNCs and cities and counties regulate cabs. If you look across the country, New York, Florida, Texas, Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, all of them, whether it's at the state level or the local level, there's one regulatory agency for both. And then finally, which is something we haven't so much mentioned, is there's a vision on the TNC side, which I think is very important to keep in mind here, that as they move more into shared rides, strangers in the vehicle together, as they start to experiment with services where you're going to work from A to B and you get on the app and you offer to take other people, so to fill empty seats on trips that are already being made. This is a vision where everyone could be both the service provider at one point and the user at another point. And it's important in thinking about the regulatory structure. And it really starts, all these things, the shared riding and this sort of fill empty seats, start to move toward more transit-like services. And so it's important to think about not just traditional taxi cabs and exclusive ride point-to-point TNC services from a regulatory and service standpoint, but to think about where it's going and what's an appropriate structure and set of regulations for that context. And then my last slide, and I just want to just kind of throw this up here because I'm trying to sort of bring together the different considerations here, is that I think the goals of a regulatory framework that you see discussed in our report are flexibility, openness, accountability, the importance of preventing abuses, all to serve the goals of mobility, economic efficiency, and equity.
Thank you. One thing that wasn't covered that is of particular interest to me is the having a quality job for the workers themselves. The taxis try to address it by putting a cap on the number of vehicles in a particular market. So the idea is that if you want somebody to be able to turn a profit in the transportation industry, you create a market in which they can go out there, operate, and make some money. If you flood the market with too many vehicles, the drivers won't make a living. They won't want to go into that industry, and thereby it would create an absence of service that local governments try to tailor for their specific regions. So there are more lucrative markets in some parts of the state than others, and they have a harder time filling the transportation needs of their region, so they come up with a transportation framework that works. Not every part of the state can have a bus service, so they try to find other ways to do that. So looking at this model, I see that there's no cap on the amount of app-related drivers. So if I conceivably have a car and I decide I have a job, but I want to kind of enhance my income working 1 or 2 days a week, and I decide when that is based on the, the fluctuations in the cost of service, and that draws me into the service, I can go in there and pretty much, because I have a job, I could just enhance my income, but that's taking income away from somebody who does it full time. And they look forward for those moments in high activity that's where they make their living. They can work 8 hours a day and maybe 6 hours of the day they're not working, and it's that 2 hours when the market picks up where they actually make money. And they're out there sitting in a stand or waiting for a call, waiting for that business to come, and nobody knows when the business is going to come. People can predict, well, there's the 2 o'clock in the morning rush hour, there's the the convention that's coming to town. That's when everybody sees the convention, they either lease a vehicle or they go out to work. But generally, you got to make a living, and you got to feed your family, and you got to pay your rent. And to do that, you got to put in a fair amount of hours to go out there and make a living, especially in this industry. When you see the charter party carriers or the transportation network companies come in and flood the market, or they can come in and set the price really low. So customers say, well, I want to go with the cheaper service. They do that, and it creates a shift in customers toward that service, and it creates an imbalance over here where people are working full-time trying to, make a living. So keeping that in mind and saying, you know what, in this country, we currently have a problem, that we are seeing a growing disparity between the rich and poor. The middle class is pressured. We see middle class disappearing. We see a working family now, the husband and the wife needs to work to pay the bills today. Now we're seeing people having to have a job and then moonlight, maybe in the transportation now. And that's creating a situation where people that are full-time drivers over here, their jobs are being eliminated. So we're seeing really an industry that provides a living to a lot of people will soon only be an industry that's enhancing income for people that are using it as part-time work. So, and then you hear about the industry moving toward creating a driverless vehicles, so a driverless service. I mean, what are we doing here? I mean, have you looked at that as, you know, if we are a state that cares about our workers and we want to provide them with a quality job within an industry that they could maybe one day, you know, work in and one day own themselves, and I mean, does this provide, what are we doing here with this industry? Is this jeopardizing that? Is it jeopardizing the American dream? Are we going to move to drivers that are going to be part-time? And what happens to those drivers that don't own a car, or don't own a car that is up to the standard that the company wants, is accepting? Or if they lower their standards in terms of what's a qualified car to participate in this program, and we have, you know, underinsured, maintained vehicles operating in the market, who is gonna regulate that? Who's gonna decide? If I don't own a car, does that mean I can't have a job in transportation? That means I have to go out there, buy a car, insure it, and if I don't have the money, does that mean I'm out of a job and I don't have any opportunity in the future to ever work in an entry-level industry as this, or an industry that offers me the ability to go in and make a living just by showing up but with a driver's license and a fairly inexpensive process to get a job. A lot of people do go in as lease drivers because they don't have to go through a job interview. And then they have a job, but now in the future, are they going to require to, I mean, does any of you comment on that?